This overlooked RU Pokemon is actually disgustingly good in competitive OU tournaments. Maybe not Landorus good, but actually viable, despite being 2 whole tiers lower. Let's find out why. Weezing-Galar has been climbing higher and higher in usage the past 3 official OU tournaments, despite never being in the OU tier itself. In Smogon Champions League, which happened last summer, it had a 2.84% usage rate. This was ranked 44th overall. In SPL, this pretty much doubled and went to a 5.38% usage rate, where it jumped to 34th in usage. And then World Cup, the ongoing tournament, in round 1 it had a staggering 9.68% usage rate, and rose again to rank 24. Over the span of these 3 tournaments, weezing-Galar has had a total win rate of 52.5%, which might not sound like a lot, but is pretty incredible given what tier it's in. Many OU Mons don't actually have positive win rates. So, it's growing a lot in OU official team tournaments, and it's seeing more and more usage, and it's winning. But why? As we'll come to discuss, there's a lot of reasons for this, but one of the biggest is that its exceptionally unique ability called Neutralizing Gas completely shifts any OU game. What Neutralizing Gas does is it makes it so your opponent's ability effectively doesn't exist while Weezing is on the field. This is slightly different from Mold Breaker, which for instance, if you're used to seeing Mold Breaker Excadrill, it'll ignore Rotom Wash's Levitate, but it won't make it so all abilities on the field magically don't exist. In OU tournaments, this is most critically relevant to Golden-Go, who is very often seen on hazard stack teams. With Neutralizing Gas, its broken ability, Good as Gold, no longer blocks status moves. Defog is a status move, and Weezing of course learns Defog, so now you actually have a way to remove hazards versus Golden-Go, who's also otherwise a ghost type and can't be used Rapid Spin against. There's other removal options in the tier that are actually very potent, such as Great Tusk, Iron Treads, Hatterene, Corviknight, and Cinderace. However, all of them have their own form of counterplay, whereas Neutralizing Gas really has pretty much no counters within the tier. There is one way weezing-Galar would be blocked from clicking Defog, and that's if Golden-Go had Ability Shield, which blocks your opponent from ignoring your ability. However, Golden-Go is usually too enhanced by things like Air Balloon or choice items to give up that just for Weezing. There's actually many other mons that Neutralizing Gas uniquely counters, and this is true for both offensive and defensive functions. For instance, Samurott Hisui is walled as a hazard setter because Sharpness is deleted, and that's its main form of doing a lot of damage. Also, Hatterene can't use Magic Bounce, which is pretty much the main feature of why it's an OU. And for Weezing, this allows you to easily set up Toxic Spikes, which are especially good versus hyper offenses. You'd often see Hatterene on as their only deterrent for any kind of hazard control. Not only are Araquanid's water moves no longer buffed by Water Bubble, but you can actually always burn it with Will-O-Wisp until you switch out and then the burn is healed. Also, if you either set up spikes or toxic spikes, Levitate mons like Latios or Hydreigon are no longer ignoring these. Garganacl is seen as one of the most annoying Pokemon in OU defensively, and that's mainly because of Purifying Salt, which doesn't allow it to get statused in any way. Of course, Weezing completely ignores this ability, so you can hit it with a Toxic or a Will-O-Wisp. Another defensive mon that kind of really hates weezing-Galar is something like Alomomola or Pex, which has Regenerator and suddenly can't heal just by switching out like it can versus everything else in the tier. As one final example, you can even pressure down Gliscor by simply existing. Poison Heal no longer works, and since it ticks upwards in damage it would be taking if its ability was removed every turn it's on the field, you could do insane amounts of damage just by making it no longer heal and take that full poison in one turn. When taking into account all of these examples, something becomes apparent in a broader sense. Weezing-Galar is excellent at applying immediate pressure onto teams, despite existing in theory as a very passive wall. Unless you have something like a Heatran, it pretty much forces teams to either take poisons or burns, or take moderate damage from its attacking moves. It also pressures from a defensive point of view because it uniquely shuts down so many Pokemon. And this isn't only because of Neutralizing Gas, it's also because it has an amazing natural typing in Poison and Fairy. One of the most terrifying mons to wall in the OU tier is Iron Valiant, which can have Close Combat, Knockoff, or Moonblast all at once. Weezing resists all 3 of them and can heal verse it with Pain Split or just attack it for huge damage. When I bring up applying immediate progress forcing that weezing-Galar offers, this isn't to be confused with continuous progress forcing. It's great at making an initial dent in your opponent's team early, but it isn't like a Choice Specs mon that has permanent access to being threatening. One aspect to really consider about this functionality of Weezing is that its ability to force progress against the opposing team feels absurd in comparison to other common OU walls. let's consider Alomomola, Dondozo, and Corviknight. They all have better healing capabilities than Weezing, who has to rely on Pain Split to immediately heal, which is admittedly pretty shoddy. However, these three mons are purely reactionary. The best example to compare this to is Corviknight. Both Weezing and Corviknight exist as physically defensive walls that learn defog. While this is true for both of them, Corviknight is terrible at pressuring the opposing team. Everybody has a body press or Brave Bird switch in, where its main draw is just clicking U-turn in order to get something more threatening in. Weezing doesn't suffer from this fate and can defog while pressuring teams in a variety of ways. One of the coolest elements of weezing-galar that aids in pressuring the opponent is its move pool. Despite being a defensive Pokemon, it can run a ton of moves that completely viably annoy your opponent, and they have to react differently every single time. Defog is generally a must on Weezing, but beyond this, you can really run anything you want, whether it's Will-O-Wisp, Toxic Spikes, Strange Steam, Sludge Bomb, Pain Split, Protect. You get the picture. You could even run Overheat if you wanted, and run it with Eject Pack, and just get some momentum out of it. As I'm sure you can gather, most of the other defensive Pokemon sets that you see in the tier are more or less limited. We talked already about Corviknight, but something like Garganacl is another good example. It usually pretty much always has Salt Cure and Recover, and that usually is followed by either Stealth Rock Protect or Curse and an attacking move. And because of the simplicity of the sets, it's usually much easier to game plan versus, both in the builder and also the middle of the game, where Weezing can be a thorn in the side because you're not considering as much in the builder, but also in the game, you really don't know what sets it'll have until you're versing it, and it might be too late to counter it properly. Now you may be asking yourself, what type of teams would you see weezing-galar on at higher levels? In my opinion, usually it's seen on slower teams such as Balance, Fat Balance, and Stall. The reason for this occurs fairly naturally, but usually isn't even internally articulated upon by top players. Rather uniquely, weezing-galar is what I would call a specialized defensive Pokemon. It's unrivaled at its unique roles, but it isn't going to be walling mons of all shapes and sizes. To easily explain this, let's look at some examples of the opposite, such as Alomomola, Garg, and Corviknight. I would refer to these as generalized defensive Pokemon. You will commonly see these Pokemon eat hits from both physical and special threats. A good example to compare this to is Terra Water Garganacl, who can chew a Great Tusk Headlong Rush as well as Golden-Go. And this type of example can be true in a lot of different instances for pretty much all generalized defensive Pokemon. A large part of the functionality that makes them as such is that they have access to better recovery moves, whether this is Wish, Recover, Roost, Rest, and so on. These are all much more superior to Pain Split, which is shaky at best and isn't reliable for long-term infinite healing. This lack of healing can be somewhat mitigated by placing it on the aforementioned bulkier playstyles. It suddenly has no expectation to perform in a broad defensive role because it has allies that can heal more easily. This allows it to excel at what it does best, being a unique counter to what it's good against. You would much rather see it excel in a specialized defensive role versus being mediocre as a full-on generalized wall. There's generally two items you'll see weezing-galar use, and the conditions of this are very dependent on what type of teams it exists on. If it's a more offensive range of teams you'd find Weezing on, such as Balance, you'd probably see it run Boots. And this is because it might be the team's only remover, so having the ability to come into 3 layers of spikes without issue is very valuable for it. However, if it's on a fatter team, like Stall, then you can usually have it get away with leftovers because you have forms of double defog, wish support, and so on to give it more infinite survivability. It's worth noting that depending on what style of bulkier team Weezing is on, you can tailor your set for what you need, since usually Weezing can be the ending addition to broader defensive concepts at play in the builder. For instance, if I feel weak to HO, I can add Toxic Spikes to Weezing, and thus put everything on a timer, especially if there's no Iron Moth to remove those Toxic Spikes. However, if I feel weak to Stall, I can usually just give it Pain Split for survivability. This is further forced as an issue because usually one of Stall's main status absorbers is Gliscor, who suddenly is just poisoned taking damage in front of Weezing instead of healing like it does versus everything else in the tier. One of the most pressing things weezing-galar commonly runs is Will-O-Wisp because it puts everything on a timer, and even for physical mons, it drastically lowers their output. For instance, if my team struggles to break down something like Ting Lu, I can take some moderate damage trading Earthquake just to get a Will-O-Wisp on it, and maybe it's worth that for the progress. This trade-off is usually useful for Pokemon you might struggle to make progress first with your bulky team otherwise. Ting Lu, for instance, eats lots of poison types like Gomora, Iron Moth, and Slowking for breakfast They usually can't even touch Tinglu, it's an automatic counter. However, somehow this fat, rarely used blob that isn't even offensive can force progress versus it without losing too much of its hit points, since Will-O-Wisp can outspeed it, and then Earthquake is doing very negligible damage to Weezing's high physical defense. I would say there's definitely a countless amount of these quirky situations that this weird mon finds itself in, just forcing progress in a way nothing else in competitive OU can, even though it's this defensive, not very scary mon on paper. A huge example I didn't mention earlier, by the way, is weather, since effectively Ninetales and its Alolan twin can't even get the weather up that its team archetype requires to thrive in. Rain is another good example, where Pelipper can go for Hurricane outside of Rain, but Weather Ball is doing nothing and it doesn't have the motor that usually you'll see on Rain that helps enhance its damage output across the board. Sun is fairly similar to this in that photosynthesis doesn't activate, and even mons like Walking Wake don't receive its Hydro Steam boost in the sun. Veil is a little bit different since Veil primarily exists just to allow its more offensive buddies on the team to set up freely while taking minimal damage. Having weezing-galar, this puny RU Pokemon, stop all three of these archetypes in their tracks is extremely potent for any kind of fat team, especially, which might struggle to hold off vast offensive pressure, especially from teams like Sun. All three of these examples of how it helps shut down weather more or less ties into the broader image of why this toxic blobby friend of ours is so good in OU. It's just a huge thorn in the side of many OU Pokemon, even though it's this defensive wall that isn't meant to be threatening, and it's just tiered 2 tiers lower. I think its usage is here to stay, both in high level tournaments and on ladder, and maybe it'll find itself in OU soon enough based on usage alone. I think that's pretty much it. If you like this type of video, feel free to let me know and also subscribe. I'm obviously still very new to YouTube in general, and I'm more or less just trying to figure out what direction I want to take my channel, so your input is definitely valued. But yeah, thanks so much for watching, and have a good day. I hope you got something out of this for sure, because I want to teach people, you know what I mean? So yeah, bye.